The enemy does not need to defeat you if he can distort your view of God. What if you've been mislabeling what God is doing in your life? Or what if you've been attributing, maybe even blaming the works of the enemy or sin as God's doing and thus getting beat up unnecessarily? Our greatest battle is not against the darkness, but against the lies that we believe about the light. A.W. Tozer once said, "What comes into our minds when we think about God is the most important thing about us." Your lens and your perspectives matter, and there is a whole lot of confusion about how God works today. Many say that pain is discipline, or we call suffering testing, or we see pruning as punishment. But God's work in your life is not chaotic or cruel. It is purposeful and it is good. And when we mix up these terms, we misunderstand His heart. And when we misunderstand His heart, we only set ourselves up for unnecessary pain and difficulty. And if I were the enemy, that's something that I would try to pervert and push among believers as well. You see, discipline is about correction, not harm. Pruning is about growth, not punishment. And testing is never about inflicting pain, but about revealing what's already true in you. And suffering, that's the result of a fallen world, the enemy, and of sin. It's not a tool that God uses to teach us a lesson. For example, if I broke my 2-year-old's arm to teach her a lesson, I'd be done for child abuse. Yet many think that God is like this, and that's crazy to me. God is better than we think, and our challenge is believing it. And so if you've been caught up with these mix-ups, it's not your fault. Many of us have been taught this way, but this misunderstanding, or rather these misunderstandings, can make us pull back from God when we should be running towards Him. It's hard to love somebody who you also hold responsible for your punishment, for your hurt, for your affliction. And so let's untangle the confusion together. And the way that we're going to do it is I have laid out 10 key truths and 5 practicals to help you see clearly and to break free from these harmful beliefs. And so the goal for me here is to help you to enjoy more peace, more freedom, and more goodness with God and in life. I want you to understand His heart, His nature, so that you can enjoy more intimacy with Him and enjoy the fullness of life that He always intended for us. And so the way that we're going to do it is we're going to tackle the 10 ways that we mislabel these different experiences, which we've talked about already. I'm going to go through some examples, and then I'm going to give you the truth. And then we're going to wrap this up by giving you guys 5 practicals to move forward in His goodness. So, first one, pain and suffering. Now, pain and suffering is the result of living in a broken and fallen world. And this can stem from sin, it can stem from the enemy, it can also stem from our own choices. And so the way that we get confused, and this way that this just gets mixed up for us, is that many think that God causes pain or suffering to test us or to punish us. And it's easy to assume that because we're suffering, it must be a test from God, especially when we're trying to make sense of hardship. And so some examples of this are sickness or death, or financial struggles, natural disasters, or relational breakdowns. These are just some of many different examples that many times we call God's suffering or pain for us. But the truth is, pain and suffering are not from God. They come from a fallen world, from sin and the enemy. God is with us in these times, offering comfort and healing. So it's important that we understand that, yes, there is a suffering for righteousness, which we'll go through soon, but in terms of pain and suffering that we experience in the world, whether it be death, sickness, financial struggles, this is the result of a fallen world, of sin, and of a very real enemy. But many times you and I will point the finger at God when it has to do with, say, for example, the enemy, and then we wonder why we never escape the different cycles that we're stuck in because we've wrongly blamed God for it when it's not Him at all. Instead, He meets us in these times offering comfort, healing, strength, and goodness. So that's the first one, pain and suffering. Secondly, pruning. Now, pruning is a loving and refining process where God removes what hinders our growth to help us bear more fruit. And so the way that this gets mixed up is that many times we will confuse pruning with punishment. And so we think that God is causing pain for no reason. And when we face discomfort, it's easy to feel like God is punishing us rather than refining us for the better. So some examples are letting go of unhealthy attachments, negative emotions, or habits that prevent spiritual growth. And so you may have already experienced many times in your life where you've been participating in, say, negative habits that you know are not healthy for you, and then you've been challenged to let those things go. You've been put in a position where I've got to lay that down, and that can be very uncomfortable because it's part of that repruning process. It's not God punishing you, it's His pruning. And so pruning is a loving action designed to help us to grow stronger, to be more fruitful, and it's not a punishment. And so when you think in the natural, when it comes to pruning a plant or pruning a tree, for example, there are a number of reasons for it. One is that you can prune parts of the plant, that are unfruitful. And so that's one of the reasons. There could be aspects or habits or areas in your life that are just unfruitful. And this may be where God's inviting you to cut those areas out of your life. It could be relationships, it could be connections, it could be a job, it could be many different things. Or another reason why we might prune a plant is because there's infection or disease. So this could be areas of your heart, of your soul, unforgiveness, bitterness, anger, areas where God wants to prune and cut off. And so pruning is a loving process. It's not God's punishment. So that's the second one, pruning. Third one, discipline. So this is God's loving correction to guide us back to his way when we've strayed and made poor choices. So the way that we get this mixed up is people often view discipline as God's anger or punishment rather than a tool for growth. And when we face consequences or correction, it can feel harsh, leading us to confuse it with punishment when it's not. And so some examples of this are experiencing the natural consequences of a sinful decision, like strained relationships. Maybe you spoke wrongly of somebody, you gossiped about somebody, maybe there was immorality that happened, and now you're experiencing strained relationships because of that. And the discomfort is an invitation to reflection and change. So maybe you've experienced that, and that discomfort of, man, these people are they don't see me in the same way, or I'm struggling with this guilt or shame around it. That is an invitation from God to now reflect and change on the habits that led to that certain action. So the truth is that discipline is not punishment, but a form of love intended to bring us back to alignment with God's wisdom and to protect us from harm. Number 4, tests. Tests. So tests is a challenge that reveals the strength of our faith, and it's not meant to harm us but to strengthen us. And it's actually a good thing because it reveals the work of God that He's already done in us, or the work of the Spirit rather. And so how this gets mixed up is that many times we believe God sends tests to cause us suffering or harm, viewing them as proof of God's displeasure. And it's tempting to think that if we are in a tough situation, it must be a test from God to prove something about our faith. And so an example is a tough decision that challenges your values, or a trial that makes you rely more on God. So a job loss, for example, that many people, I know for myself, when we went through the COVID mandates, that was a real test for us. And that wasn't a test put on by God. Rather, it was a test that governments decided to do. It was a pressure that governments decided to put on people. But God worked it and turned it around to now reveal that we were strong enough to stand and not fold or compromise on our values. And so it actually worked out for our good. And the truth is that test isn't about God making life hard or to prove your worth. It's about revealing what's already inside you, your trust in Him and your ability to rest in His goodness, even in uncertainty. So again, like for us in losing a whole lot of our income through the mandates, that revealed how much we were able to just rest and trust in His goodness, even when we had no clue where provision was going to come from. Number 5, temptation. So this is the desire or urge to do something wrong, often arising from our own flesh or the enemy. This gets mixed up because many times we confuse temptation with a test from God, believing He's the one tempting us. And so we mistake it for something God has orchestrated when it's not. An example of this being tempted to engage in immorality, a lie, gossip, steal, sexual immorality. But the truth is, God does not tempt us, James 1:13. Instead, it comes from our own desires or external influences, and instead, God provides a way out. 6, trials. A difficult situation that challenges who we are. I can probably guarantee you have been in these moments. I've been in these moments, and they are very difficult, absolutely. The way that we get this mixed up is that we often think trials are sent by God as a test or punishment rather than being part of living in a broken world. And it's common to assume that God is the source of all our trials, especially in difficult seasons. Some examples of this are a job loss, as we talked about. It could be personal grief, a loss of a family member, a loved one, or a period of emotional or spiritual dryness. But the truth is this: while trials can come from various sources, God is with us through them, turning them around for our growth and not causing them. So again, if I use that same example with COVID and the mandates, God did not put that pressure on us. That was put on us by external processes. That's part of living in a broken and fallen world. And this trial actually taught us to rely on Him more and actually to see Him as our comforter and the one who is able to make things all work for our good and causes us to grow through it. So it was a good thing. 7, refining. So this is the process of becoming more pure and more aligned with God, often through challenges. Now, the way that we get mixed up with this is we can confuse refinement for punishment, thinking that God is trying to hurt us when He's actually working us for the better. Now, refinement can feel painful, leading us to think it's a form of punishment, but really it's about making us look more like Christ. And so some examples are spiritual growth that comes through overcoming a struggle. There might be patience, there might be forgiveness, it could be anger. And so the truth is that refinement is a process that God uses to shape us and to purify us to become more like Him. Again, it's a good thing, so embrace the refining. 8, consequences. So these are the natural outcomes of our actions, particularly when we make poor choices. We often think that these consequences are God punishing us when they are simply the natural result of our choices. And we don't often want to accept responsibility for our actions, so we can mistakenly blame God. And I see this play out too many times. So for example, losing a relationship due to dishonesty or financial trouble after poor decision making. I've seen this happen time and time again with people where they will make a foolish decision and they will suffer the consequences of that, and then blame God and say, oh, this is God's doing for me. In fact, there's a Proverb chapter 19 verse 3, I believe it says, and it says that man makes foolish decisions and then is angry at God. And so many of us will blame God for the consequences that we've brought on ourselves, and it's got nothing to do with Him. And as long as you see God as the person to blame for that, then you will never face and deal to the actual issues that are causing the consequences for you. So the truth is, consequences are not punishment from God, but they're the natural results of our decisions. Yet God is still able to redeem them when we surrender. So again, it's humility, being willing to lay your life down, come humbly before Him, and allow Him to do His work through you. 9, suffering for righteousness. So suffering that occurs because we live according to God's ways in a hostile world. Now, many believers think that their suffering is a result of their sin. In fact, I've seen many people beat themselves up, or they begin to doubt or question themselves because of the persecution of people around them, when in fact, that suffering or that difficulty is the result of their righteousness. And so suffering for righteousness can be an affirmation of our faith and alignment with God. So for example, being persecuted for your faith or facing social rejection for living a godly life. And the truth is that suffering for righteousness is part of the journey, and it's something that Jesus says we can rejoice in. As difficult as it is, it's something to rejoice in. 10, final one, God's will, God's purpose and intent for our lives. Now this one gets mixed up a lot. Many believe that every hardship is God's will, thinking that He directly causes all things, including suffering. And it's natural to assume that if something happens, it must be part of God's perfect will, even when the situation is destructive and yet it's not God's will. So for example, enduring hardship that feels like it's from God, such as a job loss or sickness or a tough relationship. The truth is, pain and suffering isn't from God, but He uses all circumstances, good or bad, for our growth and His glory when we let Him. Again, suffering, hardship was never God's original intent. That came through the fall, and because we live in a broken world, and because of man's sin, and because of an enemy that prowls around like a lion, that's why we experience difficulty and hardship. But it was never God's original intent, and one day when all this is wrapped up, there'll be no more tears, there'll be no more pain, no more difficulty. We will enjoy the original intent that God always intended for us. So those are the 10. Now here are 5 practicals to move forward and enjoy His goodness. Discern the source. So when facing a difficulty, reflect on its origin. Is this a natural consequence of a choice? Is this an attack of an enemy? Or is it a refining process? It could be any of those 10 that we already went through. So it's important to define that. Why this helps is because understanding the source prevents false assumptions about God and helps you to respond appropriately. So some examples, a job loss may be a natural consequence of an economic factor, but it can also be a moment where God guides you to something better. So keep that in mind. Number 2, reject lies and embrace truth. So actively combat lies about God with truth and prayer. So when negative thoughts come, replace them with affirmations of His goodness. And why this helps is because lies about God can distort your perception, but declaring truth aligns your heart and mind with His character and nature. Again, like A.W. Tozer said, that quote that I mentioned at the start, the enemy does not need to defeat you if he can distort your perspective of God. So it's important to declare truth and embrace truth. So for example, when you think God is punishing me, counter it with, God is my refuge and strength. Number 3, reframe your perspective. When challenges arise, consciously ask, what is God's role here? Is He my redeemer, my comforter, or my guide in this situation? And why this helps is because shifting from a perspective of punishment or abandonment to partnership with God changes how you approach difficulties. This is a massive one. And so example, instead of saying God is testing me, say this is hard, but God is with me, redeeming and growing me through it. That is such a healthy and kingdom way to look at it. Number 4, build intimacy with Him. Spend time in prayer and worship, asking God to reveal His heart to you. Be honest about your struggles and invite Him to lead you. This helps because the more you experience God personally, the less likely you are to misinterpret His nature. Examples, pray and ask the Lord, show me your goodness in this situation. Help me to see you for who you truly are. That is such a powerful and necessary prayer, and one that I'm constantly praying. Father, help me to grow in wisdom and understanding your heart and your true nature towards me and towards humanity. 5th and finally, focus on gratitude and testimony. So this could be keeping a journal of God's faithfulness. I like to keep a lot of notes and just stories and moments of where I've seen God's goodness. And so noting the ways that He's worked in your life or brought about redemption out of hard situations. Why this helps is because gratitude shifts your focus from pain to God's presence and reminds you of His goodness in all circumstances. So for example, you could write down 3 ways that God has provided or brought hope even in difficult times. And it's just such a beautiful, beautiful way to see His goodness. And so there are 3 questions there, but before we get into that, I just want to say as well, it's easy to confuse these concepts and label all forms of hardship as testing. However, the Bible presents a God as a redeemer of suffering, not the cause of it. And when you see His work clearly, you can finally walk in the peace and purpose He has for you. God is good always. And His plans for your life are not harm, and He has given us His word, His spirit, His blood, His promises, His authority, His covenant, and life so that we can still have good cheer and overcome the brokenness of this life. And when you see His work clearly, you can finally walk in the peace and purpose He has for you. So don't let mislabeling keep you stuck. It's time to know God as He truly is, and He is a good Father. God is light, and in Him there is no darkness. And C.S. Lewis once said, it is only when we see God as He truly is that we begin to see everything else as it truly is. And so here are 3 questions for reflection. First one, how have I misunderstood God's role in challenges or hardships I've faced? How have I misunderstood God's role in the challenges or hardships I've faced? Number 2, what labels have I used for difficult seasons in my life, and where were they accurate? What labels have I used for difficult seasons in my life, and were they accurate? Number 3, am I truly seeing God as a good Father who strengthens and redeems, or am I holding on to beliefs that keep me distant from His love? So I hope that makes sense to you guys. Again, the desire here is that you would grow in more freedom, more intimacy, and more truth in regard to His nature. He is a good Father. He is far better than we think. Our challenge is believing it. It's my hope, my desire that you would know His goodness, you would know His good nature and the truth of what that looks like for your life so that you can experience more of the fullness of life that Jesus intended for you and I. So bless you.